So the next age group that I'm going to be talking about is adolescents. And adolescents, I think we sometimes group as a giant group. We think of them as a giant group that is just one time period where they're all the same. And actually they have very discrete periods of development, just like when we talked about infants and preschoolers and elementary school aged kids. This is a very specific time period. And we see, I have pictures of a few TV shows on here and things, movies like Harry Potter. There's a lot of pop culture references to being in foster care or kinship care. And if you think about like the Harry Potter story, he was in kinship care and the main character, Voldemort, was in institutionalized care. So there's a lot of these threads that run through our society and that we sort of return to again and again, and that these kids see and know too. So when we look at adolescence and their development, there are 3 stages: early, middle, and late. And as you can see, there's a really wide range in when you are going to be in those stages. And for boys, it's a little bit later than the girls. And I will tell you that what we've been talking about all along is that anybody who spent any time in foster care has approximately a 2-year delay in their development. And I would say that I never met anyone in foster care, and I'm including the 18 and 19-year-olds that I've met, who were past early development in terms of their adolescent development. And I'll be talking about what that means in a moment. But when we see these kids are just like the younger kids that we were talking about, they're going to have attachment disorders, and you're going to see them either minimizing distresses and difficulties or exaggerating every distress and difficulty. When we talk about teenagers and we talk about their health and their well-being, we have to talk about risk. And the reason that we're talking about risk is because that is the top 3 causes of morbidity and mortality in the teenage population. Unintentional injuries, homicide, and suicide are the top 3 causes of death and injury in this population. Cancer is a distant 4th. And we as clinicians are always, so careful to screen for cancer and check for cancer and not miss somebody who has cancer. And so when we were working with this population, of course, we are checking for cancer, but it is more important that we're checking for unintentional injuries, homicides, and suicides, which are behaviors. That's not something we can do a blood test on necessarily. These are choices and decisions that people are making, risk behaviors that people are taking that affect their short and long-term health. Now, it's also, and the other thing I'd like to point out on this slide, for adolescent mortality, is that the death rate for ages 10 to 14 is 19 per 100,000, and the death rate for ages 15 to 17 is 52 per 100,000, and that's entirely because of behaviors and choices. So I think it's really important for us to keep our eye on that. When we look at the role of risk behaviors, we want our young people to take some risks. It's really important. These are the 5 things. It's good for peer acceptance, for autonomy, for developing your own sense of identity, norms, and values. It's good coping, and you're transitioning into an adult. There's lots of examples of good risk-taking behaviors, such as running for an office, going out for a team or a play, making a new friend, asking somebody out on a date, sitting at a new table in the cafeteria. These are all different types of risks that you take that are really, really good, important risks to take, and you could not develop normally if you did not take these risks. So what we try to do, all of us who work with teenagers, is we try and promote this type of risk-taking behavior and try and reduce the type of risk-taking behavior that can really hurt them. And so that brings us to perceptions of risk. And teenagers have a notoriously difficult time understanding their own risk behaviors. And it's because of that developmental time period, that early, middle, and late adolescence. So if we look at early adolescence, their ability to understand the world around them is very, very concrete. And they are very self-centered. Their bodies are doing an explosive amount of growth. They are changing, their bodies are changing really dramatically, and their ability to sort of plan for the future is very, very limited. So this is the time period when if you ask them what they want to be when they grow up, they probably would say something like, I'm going to play professional basketball, or I'm going to be the next star of American Idol, or I'm going to design, video games. And those are their ideas. That's what they're going to do. And then as they get into middle adolescence, this is the time for where peers are your peak influence. So that middle adolescent period from about 13, 14 to 15, 16 is when peers are the most important and really shape your behavior and what you're doing. That is also the time period when you have some ability to think about your future, but it's still really quite limited. You're still mostly thinking very concretely. And so if you ask someone in that time period, you might find them on the high school choir. They might be, they might have formed a band that meets in their garage sometimes, and they know how to read music and stuff like that, but that's what they're doing towards becoming the American Idol star. And they might still have that as a goal, but they're sort of realizing that, okay, I'm doing these other things and maybe that's not going to actually happen. Maybe I'm going to be, maybe I'm going to be one of the judges on American Idol, or I'm going to be a recruiter for talent or something like that. And then once you get to be a late adolescence, this is a time period when the peer influence and importance diminishes somewhat, and the adults in your life, the consistent adults in your life, become more important again, and such as parents or caregivers or CASAs become more important again. And it's also a time period when you finally achieve the ability to really think for future-oriented thought. You get the idea that this is a long road you're planning for, and that it is a long trajectory, and you get realistic about what you can accomplish. So if by the time you're 17, 18, 19 years old, and your garage band still hasn't gotten any shows booked, and you're no longer on the choir, then maybe you're taking classes at West Valley or here at San Jose State on media and how to video record something, or how to manage sound systems for a radio station or something like that. You've taken that initial desire and interest, and you're turning it into something very pragmatic and skill-based, and something that you can not just learn and master, but use as your vocation. So you should see a shift from the fantastic thinking of early adolescence to a little bit more reasonable in your middle adolescence, but still somewhat fantastic, to fairly pragmatic with a decent plan in your late adolescence. And that doesn't happen by yourself. Rarely can an adolescent achieve that transition without a tremendous amount of support and scaffolding from the adults around them. The other thing that we know from brain development, and we've looked at brains and mapped brains, is that adolescence is not finished until the age of 26. So until the age of 26, there's still a tremendous amount of connections being made in your brain. And many of the advocates that I talk with and train are over the age of 26. And if you think back to what you were like in your early 20s and mid 20s, and what you were like in your late 20s and onwards, you can see a real difference in how you were able to think about things and understand things and your view of the world. And it's because your brain was not done. It was still making connections. It was still connecting all of that higher level information and making it all come together. So really, in an ideal world, we wouldn't be leaving these kids at 21 even. We would extend that through the period, full developmental period, all the way up to 25 or 26. But we're not doing that. So the great thing is that advocates can support that transition really beautifully. Because most of kids in foster care have that developmental delay, they're still thinking very fantastically about their options and their long-term plan. And they basically have an incredible amount of difficulty making a long-term plan, and they certainly have difficulty building the steps to make a long-term plan happen. What we saw with one young person in particular was that sometimes this experience of being in the system leads you to an unrealistic set of expectations about what you're going to be able to do after you age out of the system. So he had been in a group home and he had been in foster care for many years. And his former roommate had had a mental health condition that granted him disability. So when he aged out of the foster care system, he got himself a 1-bedroom apartment funded by the state and an $800 check every month given to him by the state. And this young man's plan was that I'm going to get an apartment from the state and I'm going to get my $800 a month. And to a 17-year-old, that sounds awesome. To have your own apartment and get $800 a month, it seems like what more could you ever want in life? And so it was incredibly difficult. We never really succeeded in teaching him or showing him that that was not his plan. He was not going to get on disability when he aged out of the system. He was not going to get an apartment. None of those things were going to happen for him. It was very, very difficult because he had seen it happen. It was his roommate. He had been cared for by the system his entire life. The system had given him somewhere to live and given him some sort of a stipend. And so it was very hard for him to understand that that wasn't going to always be the case. When we think about the perception of risk in teenagers and in anybody really, there are factors that go into perception of risk that affect whether or not you think something is risky and whether or not you decide to do it. And one of the things that puts kids at an even greater risk, anybody really, but kids in particular at a greater risk, is if they have some sort of health condition that affects their ability, that affects them. So for example, if a diabetic teenager takes their insulin and then goes to a party where everybody's drinking, they forget to eat, and they get dangerously low in their blood sugar, they start shaking, they start slurring their words, they collapse in a corner. Everybody is going to leave them there because it's a party and they're thinking that they're just drunk. But in fact, they're having a dangerous, or incredibly life-threatening situation. So everybody has all of their health that comes into your factors of thinking about perceiving your risk taking. And then there's all of your developmental abilities that come into your ability to understand a long-term risk. So when I used to work with teenagers at a school-based health center, and I was doing a lot of reproductive health counseling, and I would ask a young woman, how many times are you having protected sex or using a condom? And she would say, oh, all the time. And then I would say, okay, if you have sex 10 times, how many times are you using a condom? And the girl would answer 6. And so to her, 6 meant all the time. And that's an example of very concrete thinking. It was more than half, and so to her that meant she had no risk of getting pregnant because more than half of the time she was using a condom. There was a really famous pregnancy prevention advertising campaign down in Southern California where they had these big billboards and they had young people, that a teenage girl pregnant on there, and it said, it just takes one time. And they had this massive influx of teenage girls coming into the clinics pregnant and relieved because they thought they were infertile, because they'd had sex once, didn't get pregnant, and they inferred from that concrete thinking that they were in fact infertile. And I saw many of those cases myself where girls were relieved that they were pregnant because they'd had unprotected sex several times, didn't get pregnant, and thought they were infertile. So that's an example of concrete thinking, and it's an example of, it's not their fault, they're not choosing to be difficult, it's part of their brain development, that it just doesn't make sense to them to think about these long-term planning just does not make sense to them until they have more brain connections and brain development. And then if you think about risk-taking in terms of having had an experience where you've been maltreated or abused, if you've been in the system long enough, all of your assessments of risks are affected by being in the system and by these experiences of abuse. We know, for example, that sex workers, almost all sex workers, have had some sort of sexual abuse history. And so that puts them at greater risk for perceiving the risk of sex work as a more doable option. And in fact, what we know and we say as clinicians is if a girl has disappeared for more than a couple of days and cannot tell us where she has been, we assume that she has done some sex work in order to survive, and we treat her as such. We give her a full screening and care. It's really become a really, really sad and terrible problem here in the Bay Area, and particularly in the East Bay around Oakland. And there is a program through Children's Hospital Oakland called Rebecca that works with young girls and teenagers who have done sex work and tries to help them with therapeutic services. But it's very, very difficult. One of the advocates that I worked with this was another example of a really perfectly chosen person. She chose a girl who was 14, who had been on the streets for many months and had done sex work. And the CASA was a reproductive health educator. So it was a really wonderful pairing because she was very knowledgeable, she wasn't very squeamish, and it allowed the girl to be really, build a really comfortable rapport with her. I have a slide in here about parenting teens in the system, and if people are interested in working with a parenting teen, it's a really wonderful thing to do because these girls have not had a positive parenting example. And depending on how old they are really at a disadvantage in terms of their development. Because if we think about what parenting is all long-term planning. And if they're young and they're developmentally delayed because they've been in the foster care system, they're just getting through their day each and every day. They're not thinking about the long-term wellness, health and wellness and benefit of their child necessarily. We also know that parenting teens who are in the system are at greater risk of sudden infant death syndrome. They need a lot of education about how to care for their babies safely. We know that that there's a baby daddy somewhere, and that these mothers are at great risk for having another pregnancy, and they're also at really great risk for losing their child to the system themselves, for having their child taken away from them for maltreatment. So they're really at a great group to work with. So we've been talking about all these risky things and negative things, and I'd like to come back to resilience and the things that we're trying to do to promote the positive aspects of all young people, and particularly these kids who are in foster care. And one of the things so resilience is, I've got this slide that defines it. They're also, synonyms are assets, protective factors, or strengths. And they can be internal things and they can be external things. And one of the external things is you, as CASAs. You are an asset or a strength or a protective factor for these young people. So on the next slide, the developmental assets, the Search Institute has done incredible amounts of research on what promotes positive, healthy behaviors and long-term, lifelong success and happiness. And they have all these great data sets. They have data sets specific to different counties. So they have a Santa Clara County data set where you can look at things like how much do you read for pleasure when you're in 4th grade versus 7th grade versus 9th grade versus 12th grade. You know, do you have somebody who you can trust, who you can talk to, who's an adult in those same age grades? And it's really interesting to see the shift through adolescence and to see what people in our community are doing, what kids in our community are doing and thinking and feeling. It's also got some really great questions for when you're first meeting your young person. It's got a lot of really great, fun questions that if you're feeling nervous and you'd like to have some samples of questions. So it's a great place to go for a lot of research, for a lot of information, data-driven, strength-building programming. And they've grouped strengths or resilient qualities into two groups. External things that are things like your neighborhood, your school, your community, and internal things, which are things like your commitment to learning, your positive values, your social competencies, which means like sense of humor and ability to solve a conflict, and your positive sense of identity. And I think probably from looking at this list, you can think about how our young people in foster care are already not set up with a particularly strong set of assets. So this is an activity I like to do again. This is another activity we do in class where you pick something that you were good as a teenager at doing. For example, the highest level of a video game, if you were really good at a video game. And on the next slide, there's a strengths to look for, and there's a list of qualities there. And if you look at that list of qualities, for example, if you think about being on the highest level of a video game, what did that take to get there? And I don't know if it took positive relationships, but it probably took some humor because crazy things would happen to you while you were doing it. You have to be self-directed. You have to be perceptive, independent, optimistic, flexible. You have to love learning. You've got to look up check online to figure out how to get past a level, or you might have to talk to a peer about how to do it. You have to be motivated. You have to play it again and again. Competent, confident. I don't know if spirituality would come into it. Depends on the game, I suppose. You have to be very persistent, certainly, and very creative. You have to be trying different things all the time. So those are all really wonderful qualities. Now, being the best at Halo may not necessarily get you a job, but having those qualities will definitely get you a job. So the idea is to identify those qualities and make sure they have something that they're really good at, that kids can identify themselves as being really good at, and then take those qualities and try and apply them to other things in their life that could yield a job or a positive life outcome. Yes, and so if you take whatever you thought of as your best thing when you were a teenager and you look at these qualities, you will find at least 5 of them, probably more like 10 of these qualities were needed in order to be good at whatever you thought you were good at. And that's one of the things I think advocates do best, is identify the strengths in their young person. The next slide is looking at these assets. They did some research, the Search Institute did some research looking at risk behavior and the number of protective qualities that kids had. And so you can see on the far right, there's the column of 31 to 40 assets, and you can see that the number of kids with problem alcohol use is 3%, the number of kids with violent behavior was 6%, and the number of kids with school problems was 4%. So these are kids that had a lot of those protective, positive qualities internally and externally. And then we look over at the column on the left, the 0 to 10 assets, and you can see that those kids had 45% of them had problem alcohol use, 62% of them were violent, and 44% of them were having school problems. So we know that the more positive, protective qualities and external supports a person has in their life, the less likely they are to have these really difficult, intractable problems. So in the next slide, negative factors that affect everything: substance use and abuse, mental health difficulties, and experiences of being in the system, the maltreatment that got you in the system in the first place, the system failures. So for example, one of the kids that we were working with in San Francisco in the Foster Youth Health Project was he was 15 or 16, and he had 16 placements in the foster care system. So right there, you know a tremendous amount about that child, that young person. We also had one of our advocates was working with a young person who, over the course of a year, had 6 different social workers. And thank goodness that young person had an advocate, because as soon as the next person showed up, she had her list of things that needed to be done, or she was just taking care of a lot of these things herself, because there was no way for that social worker to get current on all of their cases that rapidly with that amount of turnover. So again, having an advocate really protects you when the system is suboptimal. And then positive factors that affect everything. We know this from the data and from the research. Having a trusted adult, that's you, the advocate. Having the resilient qualities of the youth, and the consistency in the placement, in the social worker, and in the school. So years ago, we used to move the kids out of the school to put them wherever we were putting them, in the whatever foster home we found for those kids. And now we are very, very, very careful not to move these kids. It is part of your agreement as a foster parent that you will take the child to the school where they belong. You don't get to take them to the school across the street from your house. You take them to the school where they were going, and the school where they will probably return. And we know that this is highly protective for the kids and really, really good for the kids. We know that and then the other thing that I also think is important to mention, when foster parents are trained, they have similar training to you all. They have a 30-hour foster parent training program. And one of the things they are also trained is, if they work with infants, that they must hold and look at their babies when they feed them. There's no propping of bottles. There's none of this business of facing them away, because we know so much about attachment now. So I think it's important that that you as advocates know that the foster parents have been trained and are paying attention to these really important aspects of development. We also, when we look at their experience in foster care, we can, it was the reason that they were removed from the home, the success they experienced in their foster care placement, what type of placement it was, whether it was a relative placement, whether it was a traditional foster placement, whether or not that placement was successful or whether they had to move, whether there was reunification and whether that worked or whether they came back into the system, and then all of the people that are in the system that they interact with, the social workers, the judges, and then you, the advocate. And these kids are really, really aware of the fact that you do not get paid. Everyone else is getting paid. I mean, the foster care parents do not get paid very much, but they are getting paid. And so these kids are painfully aware that no one is interacting with them who isn't getting a paycheck, except for you. And so that is another really powerful place for you to come from in terms of your advocacy. I'm going to talk a little bit about kinship placements versus non-kinship placements. And we have a lot of data about these groups, and some of it is very conflicting. And the program that we have here in Santa Clara County is a groundbreaking program. We used to, when children were removed from their homes, we used to pull kids out of their homes, and then the parents had a list of things, a laundry list of things that they had to accomplish. They had to go to meetings, they had to attend parent training classes, they had to do visitation, they had to do all of these things. And if they didn't do those things, then they lost their parental rights. And that's how it used to work. And now we have a support system in place. So the substance use court specifically has a program where they will pick up the parent and get them to all of their appointments for the first several months. So the idea is that it sets them up for success, and it actually allows them to become successful in their sobriety or in their managing their mental health or whatever their difficulty is. And so the theory is that by giving them this extra support, it allows them to be very successful. And we do have a really high reunification rate in Santa Clara County. I don't know what the recidivism rate is in Santa Clara County, and I'm going to be talking about data in other places that we have seen. And the reason I'm giving you this data is that I think it's important for you to be informed and know about other programs and research that's out there, because as an advocate, you are the only person who is solely and completely advocating for the child. Everybody else is working within this system, which is geared towards reunification. And you can be the one that's assessing whether or not this is the right course of action and expressing yourself in the court. So kinship placements, there was some studies have shown that they have less. So kinship placement is a relative placement. So it's a sister, an aunt, a grandparent, a relative. They've shown that they have better behavioral development, they have higher mental health functioning, and they are more likely to have a stable placement if they are placed with a relative. And then non-kinship foster care uses more mental health services. But if we think about where somebody comes from when they're doing kinship care, so for example, if you're a grandparent and you're having to parent your grandchild, something really terrible has happened to your child. And that's a very difficult place to come from, a place of incredible grief and loss that you're coming from, whether your child's incarcerated, whether they died, whether they have a serious mental illness or a substance use problem. You know, there's an incredible amount of grief and loss that you've just suffered that is requiring you to care for that grandchild as a child instead of as a grandchild. And also there's an incredible financial burden that comes with that, and a lifestyle burden. So a lot of grandparents talk about how, you know, all of their peers are retiring and traveling and, you know, visit their grandchildren on the weekends, and their life is back to square one. One of the foster parents that I met with in my training, she had she was one of 6 brothers and sisters, and her brother had been incarcerated, and his wife was either incarcerated or had passed away. And they had 6 children between the ages of 6 and 17. And nobody else in her family would take them. They said they are a lost cause. Her brothers and sisters were completely unsupportive of her taking them in and refused to help at all. And so she had been on the cusp of retirement. She had raised her own children. She was on the cusp of retirement, she and her husband. And she had to continue working to support this group of 6 kids that she suddenly had in her house. These kids were highly, highly traumatized and had a lot of difficult behaviors, including that they all, and this is very common in terms of regression, they all wet the bed at night. And this is a very common thing we see in the foster care system. Because of the stress and trauma that they've lived through, they regress in some of their behaviors. So every morning she was having to change 6 beds again, and she was in her late 50s, early 60s, and her husband's health rapidly declined while she was caring for these kids, and he was caring for these kids, and it became an incredible stress not only on her but on her relationship with her husband. And then she was also trying to get help for these kids who were highly, highly traumatized. She said that whenever she was allowing them to call their dad or their dad call them once a week, and they would stand in a row at attention for the entire duration of the phone call, because that's what he had forced them to do when he was caring for them. So it was an incredibly hard job that she was doing, and she was doing it the very best that she could, but she desperately could have used an advocate to help her. So there's a lot happening in any kind of kinship environment. There's a lot happening, and it's really great to have an advocate be there as a source of support, and also a sort of to observe what's really going on. The other kind of placement that we see a lot of for teenagers is group homes. And we know that in group homes, they have higher risk behaviors. They have higher individual risks. They have more what we call behavioral threats to achievement, which are things like school failure. And they have more peers with risky behavior. And in this time period, as I was talking about earlier, what your peers are doing really affects what you do. And actually, what you think your peers are doing really affects what you do. So if you think your peers are all having sex, then you are more likely to have sex, regardless of whether they are actually having more sex. So that kind of goes back to that perception of risk we were talking about earlier. So that's what we look for in group homes. One of the CASAs that I was working with, although she wasn't assigned to work with the entire group home, she just had one of the foster kids that was in the group home. She did a lot of stuff with the group home at large as well. For example, it was a group home for boys between the ages of 14 and 18. And it was a farm-based setting out by Livermore. So they did a lot of work with the animals and in the fields and things like that. But one of the things she did is she took them to a vocational training fair where there were all these carpenters and master tradesmen with all of their amazing tools and their giant trucks in the parking lot. And she said it was totally eye-opening. These kids didn't even know that these types of jobs existed. And these are great jobs. These are great career, lifelong careers that they could have that don't require them to have higher level math and are highly in demand and really good, consistent jobs to have. And so that was a really great idea that she took the entire group home to events like that she identified that would be beneficial for everybody. When we look at reunification data there was a study that was done in Rhode Island. It was published out of Yale, but it was done with the population in Rhode Island. And they looked at reunified kids, so kids who had gone back to their biological parents, who had come into the foster care and then gone back to their biological parents, and what the long-term outcomes of that were. They found there in Rhode Island, there was a greater risk for maltreatment again than those who stayed in foster care. So those kids who went back to their biological parents were at greater risk for maltreatment and abuse than those who had stayed in foster care or were adopted out of foster care. And the things that they identified in this particular study that raised the risk for maltreatment again were being in foster care before and having that, and then having been reunified and then come back into foster care. Exiting from a non-relative placement, so being in a traditional foster home and not a relative or a kinship placement. Removal due to neglect, and being an infant or a child versus an older adolescent. So those were all risks that were associated with greater maltreatment and re-entering the system. So I like to share this with you because we don't know what the outcomes are for this program that we're running right now in Santa Clara County, but many of the CASAs maintain their relationship, their supportive mentoring relationship with their young people beyond reunification. So when your court role is finished and the child has been reunified, many people still stayed in touch with their young person. And so if something does go wrong down the line, it's great for you to have that connection and be a support if and when that does happen, because we know that it does happen quite a bit in reunified cases. This next slide is about reunified teenage behavior, and we found that this was a study down in Los Angeles, and they found that kids who had been reunified with their biological parents had more self-destructive behaviors, more substance use problems. They had a higher dropout of school rate, lower grades, more internalizing behavior problems, more tickets and arrests, and more overall risk behaviors. And then we found that kids who had stayed in the system versus kids who had been reunified, there was no difference in their sexual behavior, in their externalizing behavior, their pregnancy rates, or their suspension rates. So this was not a very encouraging finding. These two studies were not very encouraging and not very supportive of reunification. Again, these were programs that did not have the support services that we're offering here in Santa Clara County, but I think it's important for you as advocates to know this research and this data and just keep your eyes open and maintain that relationship long after, if you can, long after your legal role as a CASA is over. When we talk about transitions and kids in foster care going back to their biological parents, or in that period of time where they're transitioning back to the care, so they do things like they do an afternoon, and then they do a sleepover, and then they do a weekend, and they gradually move back in from their foster care placement to their biological parents' placement. And that is even if everything is going beautifully and really, really well and as planned, and the child wants it and the parent wants it and everything is going as well as planned, it's still incredibly stressful. That moving back and forth is incredibly stressful, and navigating the system during that time is incredibly stressful. So you can expect that anytime your child has had visitation with the biologic parent, that they're going to be very stressed out afterwards. And you should do something physical with them. You should go for a walk, go for a boat ride, play at the playground, do something outside that's physical with them, because it will help them to process all that extra stress hormone that they've had being released. And one of the kids that I used to work with at the clinic, when I would screen for substance use with all the teenagers, and this particular teen, she said she smoked marijuana, and I asked her, how often, and she said every Wednesday. So she would smoke every Wednesday afternoon. And so I asked her a little bit more about that, and that was the day that she had the court-ordered meeting with her father, with her biologic father. And it was so stressful to her, that was her coping technique. So again, it's great if we can provide these kids with positive coping techniques, like going for a walk or doing some exercise or doing a really fun, vigorous activity that allows them to process that stress and that difficulty. Aging out. We're getting very, very good at this. We used to sort of drop the ball on this area of development and of caring for our children in foster care, and that was part of the reason why we had such high failure rates such high rates of homelessness and incarceration, because we weren't doing a good job of getting these kids out on their feet. And really, when we think about a typical family, a non-foster family, you're not done at 21. Nobody's not getting help from their families and from their relatives after the age of 21. Everybody's still getting many aspects of mentorship and support from their families well into their 20s usually. And particularly in the Bay Area, where the cost of living is so high, the cost of housing in particular. So a lot of kids go into what's called a transitional living program, and these are often apartment buildings that are owned by foster care agencies, and they have a roommate, and they have a loose set of rules, they have curfew, they're not supposed to have pets, they're not supposed to have overnight guests, they get a stipend, so they're supposed to buy their own food and provide for themselves, and it's sort of this intermediate step into going into the world. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of shenanigans that go on there, and they usually only have a couple of checks a day. One of the CASAs that I worked with, her young person, when she first moved into transitional housing and she got her $200 stipend for food, bought $200 worth of Fruit Loops, and that was it. And of course, ate them all in like a week. So it was wonderful that she had a CASA, and the CASA was able to do all kinds of fun projects with her, taught her about meal planning and grocery shopping and budgeting. She taught her about farmers markets and different kinds of places to buy your food and all of these different kinds of things that we normally would learn from our families. And indeed, we have a program that's supposed to give kids that, and it's called ILSP, or Independent Living Skills Program. And it's a wraparound program. It's supposed to teach kids about their finances. It's supposed to teach them about their household and sort of how to manage all of their all of their business as they become adults. And this is a mandatory program in California. All kids who are 16 in the foster care system need to be attending this program. And this was actually one of the things that I had an advocate do a tremendous amount of work with, because the only training program that they used to have for all of Alameda County was in downtown Oakland. And it was at from 7 to 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night. And they used to have a van that had a grant funding that would go around to all the group homes way out in Livermore and all of those areas and pick up all the kids and bring them to the ILSP program. And then after the ILSP program was over, they would bring them home. And there's all these incentives to go to the ILSP program for the kids. So they get something like $10 a time that they go. And if they complete the whole thing with perfect attendance, they get something really amazing, like a laptop computer or something like that. They have really great incentives for promoting attendance to these things as well. But unfortunately, the funding for the van ran out. And so this advocate was just starting out with this young man, 16-year-old boy who was in a group home out in the Livermore area. And he wasn't going to ILSP. And she noticed that he was not going to ILSP. And so she asked the foster caregivers at the group home why he wasn't going, and it was because there was no van, which is not an acceptable reason. That was their responsibility to transport that child. So they said, well, he was welcome to take BART. So that was going to be in an hour and a half each way by himself on BART at 11 o'clock at night in downtown Oakland. That's totally an unacceptable answer as well. She felt that way. I felt that way. And so she started really working on why there wasn't ILSP attendance, even though it's mandatory. And we were able to connect with Las Positas College, which all colleges have a foster care representative that works with and helps to guide kids who have spent any time in foster care, helps them to be successful in their college experience. So helps them with their planning and with their finances and all of that stuff. Most colleges have a person like that. And at Las Positas College, they have a really robust program for kids who have spent any time in foster care. And the coordinator of that program was really interested in starting an ILSP program out in the outer East Bay. So the advocate and this coordinator at Las Positas College got together and created a whole new satellite program out in the East Bay for all those group homes and kids who were really far away from downtown Oakland. They have the same benefits and the same training. And this was that group home that I was telling you about earlier with the vocational visit. They ended up bringing all of the kids, even though some of them weren't 16 yet. They all would go because they were all having so much fun there. They would cook a meal. They would talk about how to plan for it, how to shop for it, how to prepare it. They learned how to write checks. They learned how to write resumes. A wealth of great skills they were all learning there. And the whole group just went. They all got in the van, and that was their thing that they did on Wednesday nights. So that was a really lasting impact that she had, not just on her young person, but on the whole group home and really on the whole area by starting that additional ILSP program. When you're looking at your child, if they're aging out, if you're young adults, if they're aging out of the system, you've got to look at their employment, their education, and where are they going to live. And then you also have to look at how are they going to care for themselves in terms of any medications, because a lot of these medications are very, very expensive, particularly mental health medications. And so there should be a lot of continuity and connectedness between how you're going to get these medicines, who's going to be your provider. All of that stuff should be really closely monitored by the social worker, and you can be making sure that is all happening and that the young person is clear what they should be doing. We know that in order to make a successful transition into adulthood and be out of the system, it takes a lot of time and support. It has to be developmentally appropriate. So if you have somebody who's in early adolescent development, you're going to have to give them an incredible amount of scaffolding and support in order to get them to have some sort of very clear and concrete plan on how to cope. You're going to need to coordinate across all your systems, your medical, your mental health, and your social services. And you're going to need to work with a lot of different people in this situation. So I'm going to talk about a few more things, and then there's a couple of stories that I have to tell, and I think I have time for that. So my recommendations for maximizing your conversations with your young people that you're going to be working with, make sure that you have a private space. And by that, I don't mean by yourself, but I mean a space that doesn't feel like other people are listening in to you. So a walk in the park, or a booth at the restaurant, a non-judgmental attitude, which is, sometimes very hard. One of the advocates that I worked for, he was really, really great with his young person. He was probably in his mid to late 50s, the advocate was, and his young person was 12. And every time I met with the advocate, he would have this huge smile on his face, and he would be chuckling or laughing about something that this boy had done or something this boy had said. He just got the hugest kick out of this boy. He's like, I don't know what this guy is going to be. He might be a lawyer. He might be a politician. I mean, the way he just shakes my hand. And he would just talk about him with such joy, and he just really got a huge kick out of this kid. And again, it was a child he chose from a file, and that child sprung out at him. So there was an immediate connection just from the paper. And they had a great rapport. And this boy would sometimes do things that would have really bothered somebody else. Like he took him to row a boat on a lake, and the boy got him soaking wet and threw one of the oars in. And he just thought that was hysterical as well. He thought that was really, really funny. And coped with it completely fine, and just thought it was really funny. And I think somebody else would have gotten really upset in that situation, but he just thought it was funny and didn't worry about it at all. Well, this young man, this 12-year-old, was caught selling marijuana at school. And he was faced with an expulsion hearing at his school. And so the story that the kid kept telling everybody was that I just found it in the bushes and I was showing it to somebody. I was just showing it to that girl. I wasn't selling it. It wasn't mine. I just found it in the bushes by my bike. So that was his story. And he kept telling everybody this story. And he was told his CASA the same story. And he was getting really mad and saying, I can't, nobody believe, you don't believe me this, that I found it. And the CASA said to him, he handled this beautifully. He said to him, I don't believe that story because it's not true. And then that was the end of it. The boy sort of looked at him for a minute and thought about it for a minute, and the CASA handled it so beautifully, because that sent a message that, it doesn't matter to me that you made a mistake, and it doesn't, I understand why you're saying you didn't make the mistake, but it doesn't matter to me. I know that it did really happen, that you did make this mistake, and it doesn't matter. I'm still here for you. I still care for you. That particular story, I don't believe because it's not true. Not you're a liar, not you don't trust me, nothing bigger than that nice little directed piece. That particular story is not true, and that's why I don't believe it. And it sent a really powerful message to that child that it didn't matter to him, that he was still his advocate, he still really cared about him, and that he knew exactly what was going on as well. And the advocate was able to really successfully testify at the expulsion hearing, and they were able to get him reinstated with some, I think he just got suspension instead. So again, thank goodness that boy had an advocate who really cared for him and really had a great rapport with him. One of the other advocates that I worked with, she had her 13-year-old boy had hit the security guard at the school, which is automatic expulsion, but there was a hearing for it. And what we had been working on previously with this boy and his school, he was having a lot of school failure. And one of the biggest things he was failing, and many of them are failing, is gym. And the only thing you have to do to pass gym really is to dress for gym and then go to gym. Those are the only things you have to do. And he wasn't doing either of those things. And so we were having all of this back and forth with the PE teacher about how much he needed to change, and whether if he, all these compromises on if he participated a little bit, would he get credit, and all of these things. And so we're really working hard and struggling with this gym teacher. And so at the expulsion hearing for this child, the CASA went, and also, to everyone's surprise, so did the gym teacher. And the gym teacher went and testified that he was a really good kid, and that what she would do from now on, because this altercation had happened during lunchtime, and the kid was getting into a lot of trouble at lunchtime. She said from now on, from March until the end of the year, that he could come and eat lunch with her in the gym. And so he ended up establishing this amazing rapport with this teacher, and getting this really protective environment that got him through the rest of his 8th grade year and then on to high school. And then luckily, the advocate, knowing that whole story, was able to try and set something similar up in the high school, try and get him connected with a teacher at the high school who could also support him in that way. So again, CASA just sort of noticed things and supported the positive things that were happening in these kids' lives. Another example of really great advocacy that CASA did is one of her kid had been moved from one group home to another, and it required a school change. And I was talking earlier about we don't normally do that, but in this particular case, we had to do it. And this kid had been having a lot of failure in math. And nobody had really been thinking about that or doing anything about that. They had just been he had just been failing math for as long as anybody could really remember. And he was 16. And so this advocate, she was a parent of teenagers herself in the same area. So the first thing she did was advocate for him to be assessed before he was placed into his math class. And then she argued for him to go into summer school. So he got to start at the school before the beginning of the school year. He got to go over the summer, get comfortable at the school, get his bearings, and also really get himself back on track with math, because math is one of those things where if you miss one concept, you're completely lost. And remember, these are kids who have attachment disorder, so they're not going to ask questions, and they're not going to ask for help. They're going to just decide, well, this is it, I don't get it, that's the end of it. So she mapped that out for him, got him into an appropriate level math class, so he was able to achieve some measure of academic success in math from that point forward. And the other thing that she did is he had mentioned that he'd really like to play football. And because she was in the community and because she knew about the sports in the area, and she knew something that I did not know, which is if you want to play football, you have to do the summer training program. So because she knew the coaches, she was able to contact the coaches, say, I've got this kid, he really wants to play. Can he come out for the summer training program? And that would have never happened. It would have been already not an opportunity he could have if he had just showed up on day one and gone to the coach. But she knew that this was the work that needed to be done beforehand to set him up for success. And he went, and he was on the JV team. And then she was one of those people that had really great cameras, those really great, high fancy cameras with the big lens. And she would go to his games and took these amazing action photos of him, striding out on the field with his full uniform on and the football under his arm. He looked like a professional athlete. And she blew that photo up for him in an 8x10 frame. And every placement that he moved to after that, that was the first thing she would see up in his room, was that picture of him as the star football athlete. So it was a tremendous thing to do for his confidence, his identity, and also just a great opportunity for him to learn to do something like that. And again, it would never have happened if it hadn't been for that advocate. Let's see. I mentioned briefly earlier that when the medical evaluations for these kids should be happening every 6 months, every time they have a new placement, and anytime there's a new medical situation. And I've listed, under the what on this slide, I've listed all of the things that any clinician who's working with adolescents should be asking. And so if you have any worries about your young person, you think something is wrong, or you have concerns about their behavior or about their thoughts, you can take them in. You can talk to the foster parent about taking them in. You can help take them in. One of the advocates that I work with, the foster parent that she was working with couldn't drive. And so she would do all the driving for optometry and picking up glasses and all the things like that. And that was just part of their incorporated visit. The foster parent would let her know that he needed a new pair of glasses, and they would coordinate with the timing, and she would take care of the medical visit and then do the visit with the child, like go to the movie or do whatever they were going to do together. So I want to make sure I've covered all the foster stories that I like to share with you about the great work I saw with the advocates that I was working with. Let's see. So there was one foster parent that I was working with on the very first day that the child arrived. Everything seemed fine in the morning, and then by the afternoon, the child was having a great deal of difficulty walking, and this was about an 8-year-old child. And the foster parent was an experienced foster parent. She took her immediately to the emergency room, and it turned out that it was a really scary, rare viral infection, and that she needed to be hospitalized. So I share that example with you because sometimes they're new to you, and you don't know if it's a behavior or if it's an actual problem. And you don't need to decide. You can go ahead and get them evaluated. If it's something that's concerning you, go ahead and get it evaluated. A splinter in a 4-month-old's hand. So this was a case of sometimes, a foster parent had taken the child to a parent reunification meeting. So they had time with the biological parent, the baby had, and the biological parent accused the foster parent of hitting her child with a wooden spoon because she thought there was a splinter in the child's hand. So again, this is a very small thing that somebody could notice, and the meaning of that could be very significant. But it turned out it was not a splinter, it was a piece of dirt, and everything was fine. The foster parent was a great foster parent. But that's just another example of noticing something and following up on it. The kids in the foster care system are really good at knowing how to manipulate the system. One girl who we had placed who was unhappy with her place, she had been moved recently and she didn't like her new placement, and so she just stopped showering. And after 2 weeks of not showering, she was moved to a new placement. And that was actually a very clever and benign way of forcing a move. But I would also argue too, like that she could have used a lot of support there. And if she had had an advocate who could have worked with her and found out what the problem was, maybe she didn't have to have that history of moving again. We had the girl I was telling you about earlier who her advocate was a reproductive health worker. And the girl had done a lot of sex work in order to survive. It was a very hard case, and the girl ran away several times, but the advocate remained her advocate, and so whenever she would come back into the system, she was one of the first people that the girl would contact. And sometimes the girl would come back into the system, she would be picked up on the streets, and she would give a false name, but when she had her phone call, she would call the advocate. So it's even when you feel like you're not being very effective or successful, you have planted a seed of trust and connection with these young kids that really, really lasts. Let's see. And okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up here with my summary of my advice to you as an advocate. Choose a child that really speaks to you. Stick with it, even if things are tricky or difficult. Use your resources, meaning your supervisor, your social worker, your foster parent. Have a buddy, so somebody in your training class who you find that has a connection with, you have a connection with, and you can talk to. And savor the positive moments, because they will be there. They absolutely will be there, and it's a tremendous thing that you are doing. And I really, really thank you for endeavoring to do this work, because it's very powerful and positive. My last little postcard here is that foster care gave me a better life. I paid in pain up front, and now life is better. Being adopted means that you were chosen. And I thank you for what you're going to be doing today. On the last couple of pages of your handout, there's recommended references and adolescent resources. These are great places to get information on the conditions that your children have, the medications they might be on, and any other concerns that you might have about their development. You can go there, and then, of course, use your resources that are here within the system. I thank you very much for the work you're about to do.